Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
Good morning and welcome to the Sunday session with me, Anna Hudson, aka Miss H Teaches. Thank you for joining me today and for choosing to tune in to Teachers Talk Radio, the home of free teacher CPD. We genuinely value each and every one of you, and whether you're listening live or have downloaded today's show, I just want to say that your support means a lot, and I really hope that you get something out of today's show. So firstly, as always, how are we all? How has your week been? What's one great takeaway moment from this week? What plans have you made? What things have you achieved? What's your plan for the coming week? For some of us, it's almost time to head back to school after what I hope has been a restful and positive half term. For others, you finally made it and your half term is here. Congratulations. And if I'm honest, I'm just a tiny little bit jealous of the week you've got ahead. However your week looks, I hope it brings you some positivity and happiness. And as always, if you need any support, please reach out to loved ones, support networks, charities, or us here at Teacher Talk Radio, / the Twitterverse, obviously. So, today's show, PSHE and RSE, paramount or problematic? When I chose this topic today, I knew that it would be an interesting one. I knew that it might bring up some controversial topics. I knew that for some people it could be quite stressful, for some it could be quite interesting. And I've really been struck by the tweets and DMs. It's clearly something that a lot of us are talking about, are thinking about, are planning. In some cases, yeah, definitely scratching our heads about. So for today, join me as we explore all things PSHE and RSE, what it looks like in schools, if and why it's so important, thinking about how it's delivered, what challenges it can pose, how we can move forward from the upcoming consultations that we're having with parents and carers, and why is it a topic that causes so much trepidation and concern. So on this journey, I'm not alone. Of course, I've got everybody listening. Thank you so much for tuning in. But also, I'm joined by two fantastic guests. I've got Oscar Pimlett, who's a PSHE lead in London, and Amma Larvely, who is a leadership consultant, coach and training provider. So join me as we deep dive into this topic. PSHE, RSE, or sometimes as it's known, RSHE or PD with components of PSHE. Now, for those that don't know, the statutory guidance came into effect in 2020, but because of that little known thing called the pandemic, it was actually put back to 2021. And with it came a lot of challenges for schools across the country. Many schools had already been delivering PSHE for a long time, but when that statutory guidance came in with clear information, including ensuring that we had things like policies, that we had those clear curriculum maps, that we were sharing information with parents and carers, it did prove to be quite a difficult and quite a challenging task for schools to undertake. I myself am a PSHE teacher. I'm also a personal development lead, which means that I lead on PSHE across the school, both primary and secondary. And with that came a lot of hard work, a lot of research, a lot of really considering our PSHE and RSE offer. How do we create a meaningful and impactful curriculum that is personalised and bespoke to the needs of our children, but that also is in line with that statutory guidance and doesn't cause concern for our parents and carers. I'm not going to lie, it was really difficult and challenging, and it's something that I've taken great pride in over the last few years of developing. But for lots of schools and for lots of PSHE and RSE leads, or even PD leads, it is something that is ever evolving. Now, lots of schemes and organisations break down your PSHE and RSE into kind of wider topics. Typically, lots of us refer to them as things like health and well-being, relationships and wider world, and that encompasses everything. We know that there are elements within that that are statutory. So health education and relationships education for primary, and relationships and sex education for secondary. Both of these are compulsory. And schools have been working hard to develop that offer, whether it be through timetables and policies, or like I said, even resources. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because many of us will have seen the backlash on social media over the last year, 18 months around resources, around content that's being taught to pupils across schools. In October 2023, Gillian Keegan wrote to parents and to schools regarding concerns about some of the materials used. She informed parents and schools that, of course, schools must share resources when asked. She also said that there would be an urgent review of RSHE statutory guidance with an independent panel, but we are still awaiting those results. So with all this, why is PSHE and RSE so problematic? Are we opening up ourselves as educators to issues and stresses? Do we really need to be teaching everything that we're teaching, or are we simply plugging the gaps that aren't being filled at home? Well, as I said, as a PSHE teacher, I am really passionate about the subject. I personally think it holds a massive, massive place within the curriculum. I think it's vital for all pupils to have access to a high quality PSHE and RSE curriculum. And from my own perspective, working in alternative provision, I've seen the profound impact it can have on children's health and well-being. But I also recognise that it needs to be personalised and it needs to be meaningful. So how do we create that strong curriculum offer? How do we personalise it when so many of the people who and the teachers that are leading PSHE and RSE may not be specialists, or may not have a structured timetable place within the school's offer, and so are at an ad hoc basis trying to ensure that all topics and areas are covered. For many primary colleagues that have reached out, they've talked about how their PSHE is delivered perhaps weekly, perhaps through drop-down days, but some of the feedback has been that it's either a class teacher or, on occasions, a staff member who's the PPA cover. In secondary, I've had many colleagues tell me that it's a form time offer, or that it's timetabled perhaps once or twice every half term. I've had a number of tweets from colleagues saying that one of the biggest stresses for them is trying to cover the whole PSHE and RSE content with very little scheduled time. So how do we move forward? Well, I think it would be remiss of me to not talk about some of today's focus. We are going to look at some areas, including takeaway tips and how we can champion RSE and PSHE into the curriculum, and some of that may involve having those conversations either with lead teachers or SLT. Sometimes that can be a little bit challenging, but we'll talk about how you can do that. But I would really like to hear from yourselves. How do you schedule PSHE and RSE into the curriculum? Do you feel confident delivering it if you are a class teacher in primary or a form teacher? Are you a PSHE specialist teacher? Are you passionate about PSHE but don't deliver it? Your feedback is always welcome, so please, please do get in touch. Either request to speak or DM me, as I would love to hear your thoughts. Now I am going to move on to speak to our very first guest, which is Oscar. Oscar is a lead teacher for PSHE in a primary school in London. Oscar, I'm hoping that you can hear me. Welcome to the show. Hopefully you should be able to unmute yourself now. Are you there?
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
Hi, yes, Oscar, it is lovely to hear from you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I know that you're as passionate about PSHE as I am, and I've posed quite a lot of questions around curriculum and around how we timetable, etc. But I would really love to hear about your experience and how you think we can support colleagues to improve PSHE and RSE within all schools. So firstly, welcome to the show. Can you just tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah. So, like you said, I'm a primary. Thank you very much for having me. Sorry, by the way, I should start off by saying.
Oh, you're so welcome.
Yeah, I'm a primary school teacher. I'm from the north originally, but now teaching in London. I went to university just outside of Liverpool, which I'm sure you'll know about detecting the accent. I went to Edge Hill in Ormskirk. And I did the 3-year primary education course there. And then when I finished that in kind of May 2022, I was lucky enough to get a kind of early start job in London. So I started in June, literally a month after I'd finished. Did two months in reception and then moved to year 1, where I've taught for the last 2 years. So I'm technically still an ECT. I'm in the kind of second year of that. I guess now we're halfway through this year. I'm 3/4 of the way through that ECT program. And it was at the start of this academic year, so in the September just gone, that I became the PSHE lead. So I'm coming at it, I think, from a different angle to yourself, at a kind of less experienced and maybe more kind of optimistic about the difference that we can make position, because I haven't been doing it for too long yet. But yeah,
That's absolutely brilliant. I think it's really important as well to acknowledge that. I think, I'm quite, as lots of listeners will know, I work in AP, so I work across primary and secondary, and I've been teaching PSHE and coordinating PSHE for a number of years. But there are lots of listeners and lots of teachers and educators across the UK who will be coming at this as a new teacher, whether that is as an ECT or whether that is just as a new PSHE RSE lead. And I think, there's staff that opt in, isn't there, to want to teach it, and some people are just given that lead role. So I think, your views today are going to be absolutely vital for our listeners. So what drew you to that PSHE lead? Was it a case of being given it, or was it something that you had an interest in?
It was definitely something that I had an interest in. I think for anyone who's listening who maybe isn't familiar with how it works in primary, is that most teachers tend to lead on a subject. And for me, at the kind of end of last academic year, start of this one, it was just a case of almost, I guess, kind of picking from what was free because of staff leaving or swapping subjects or going off on maternity or whatever it was. So it wasn't. It wasn't forced on me. There was a bit of a choice, but I think that the PSHE was definitely something that I always had a particular interest in myself. Anyway, I think when I was at university, there was quite a big focus on it, and that kind of led to me being quite interested in it. And I think a lot of the things that PSHE and RSE particularly now encompasses are things that I'm just generally quite interested in terms of the world kind of generally, and also how we kind of bring and sort of educate the children in that world, and the changes that PSHE and RSE is undergoing, and how we manage that, I think, has always been quite interesting to me.
No, I think you make a really interesting point there, and we had a really interesting tweet from John Rees, who said, philosophically, we are all PSHE educators, because obviously we are all in schools tackling huge issues that our young people face and are having to support them with them. So although it's got, it's framed under PSHE and RSE, or, whatever acronym you want to use, we are all delivering it every day, because we are all tackling these issues that our young people face. So, similar to you, that's what hooked me in, because I think it's a huge part of education now, is that pastoral care, isn't it, and tackling those issues, and whether that's rightly or wrongly, that's the situation we find ourselves in. So we, as educators, have a duty really to tackle it head on. So obviously, I mentioned before a little bit about some of the challenges that, there's a lot of teachers that have reached out and expressed their anxieties around perhaps delivering PSHE, or the fact that, there has been quite a lot of negative press more recently around PSHE and RSE and the resources used. For primary, but also for secondary colleagues, what do you think, delivering it hands-on, you're on the front line, what are the challenges of delivering it, do you think?
I think that kind of linking to what you were saying about it being sort of everywhere, one of the kind of the most important things is the children, and particularly for us in primary, where we do kind of teach it as a sort of block. My school, it's a block, sort of 45 minutes, 1 hour. That's your PSHE, but it does go beyond that. It goes far beyond that because of the things that we teach and the way that impacts kind of how the children develop, and also how they are in and around the school. Things like kind of behavior and attitudes towards others are things that we talk explicitly about in PSHE, but they're actually really pertinent to everything else that they do. The way that they interact with others will also come up in maths lessons or in writing lessons. The way that they manage their emotions is really important at playtime or at lunchtime. So building it into everything that we do, I think, is a huge part of it. Is, I guess, one of the challenges, and for the children to see that application as well of PSHE and RSA, particularly. I mean, for me, kind of teaching year one, we can teach something in that hour and they'll take something from it, but whether they see how they apply that is a kind of a total other question, and is a little bit more difficult to kind of build towards. It's not as simple as kind of retaining a bit of knowledge and being able to regurgitate that knowledge when asked.
Yeah, no, I massively agree, and I think sometimes there's a worry, isn't there? Well, is there evidence in the books? And it's in the books, so they've covered it. But actually, it's like you said, it's that practical application of those skills, or even just being able to understand and take on board that information. And they might not use it straight away, but when you see it within the classroom environment, when you see it in social times, or whether you see it applied outside of school, that's when it is meaningful and impactful. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in terms of the evidence, we have at my school, we have a kind of a floor book. So we'll just put sort of very kind of hands off little sort of snippets of quotes that the children have said, or particular vocabulary that's come up that was quite pertinent, or if we have done if there has been a kind of written or some sort of drawing or something that the children have been asked to create as part of that lesson, then we'll put a couple of those in it. But I think that that's not necessarily evidence of the impact. That's almost evidence of us doing the lesson. The evidence of the impact is in the children's behaviour and in the children's attitudes towards one another, and in the way that they interact with adults and with children, and their development sort of more inwards rather than what they can do. And so I think, yeah, the way that we evidence that is through their behaviour, and is, I guess, through, as the children age as well, is through their impact and how they behave in wider society as well. Because what we are kind of, I guess, what we want the children to be able to be and to develop to become is kind of sort of members of a community who are kind of contributing and who feel like they belong. So whether that is evident in how they are outside of school, I think, is also evidence of what we're doing in school.
No, absolutely. And do you face any other challenges? Because obviously there'll be secondary colleagues that listen, but I'm thinking particularly about primary. There's my own understanding of the curriculum, because obviously I plot it too. There's quite a heavy content from year 1 to year 6, and it's there's quite a lot to cover, and it obviously, as you move into that kind of key stage 2 phase, it does increase in content, and quite rightly increases in that kind of more adult concepts. Does that pose any challenges? Does that, is that difficult to navigate, do you think?
I think so. Yeah, I think similar to kind of what you were saying about it, how it must be for colleagues in secondary, that there's still kind of difficulties in terms of the public attitudes and the public's understanding of what it is, and public and parental kind of understanding and attitudes towards what we teach, particularly the new kind of the RSE and the sort of the more the statutory guidance around things that we need to be teaching. The kind of the relationship side of it and the sex education side of it, we only touch very briefly on the kind of the sex education side of it within the sort of primary school, but it's still, I think a part of the curriculum which isn't understood by a lot of the kind of the parents of the children that we're teaching this to, and I think it's through that lack of understanding sometimes that a bit of animosity can be created towards it, particularly kind of when you look at how, I guess, the media is sort of presenting a lot of the kind of issues that we're sort of talking about. It's quite easy to see, I think, how they can be sort of skewed and sort of maybe not understood kind of in terms of what we're actually trying to do.
Yeah, I think you make a really good, interesting point, and I think there definitely has been a rise in negativity, and some of that, has been warranted, because I think we brought this statutory guidance into play at a time that was challenging and difficult anyway, and then it was sort of like, get on with it. And of course, like all teachers, we are time poor. Some schools buy into schemes, some use their own resources, and there have been some examples where perhaps resources haven't been appropriate, or maybe haven't been screened as effectively or as carefully as you would hope. But I guess there's some challenges around there, isn't there, in terms of training and for staff, and the challenge of making sure that all staff understand all the content, that if a scheme is used, it's been screened properly, it's appropriate, it's being used in the appropriate way. And I guess a challenge that fits in with that is around staff CPD. I mean, what are your thoughts, Oscar? Do you think it should just be specialist teachers that deliver PSHE? You've had that rigorous training. Do you think there needs to be more training for staff around it? What are your thoughts?
So for us at primary, I think that the idea of it being a specialist is something that I'm not necessarily for. I think at primary, I
Yeah.
think with the ages of the children that we teach, and kind of the way that they interact with us, I think it's really important that they see that this subject, which is really important and is about their kind of their holistic, their whole development, I think it's important that they see that they get that from adults that they're familiar with, and that they
Mm,
know, and who teach them in kind of in all the other subjects, and so that they can kind of, I guess, the importance of it is reflected by the fact that it is us who's doing it. But I think you are right in that there has to be there should be some more kind of development for staff who don't necessarily feel that comfortable teaching it. I think one of the things that we do at my school is we use a scheme for the kind of the RSE aspects of the curriculum, because that allows us to, I guess, like you're saying, being a little bit more robust in that we know that we are all kind of saying the exact same things when it comes to
mm,
those parts of the curriculum, because it is really important with those more kind of, I guess, with the kind of statutory and more contentious, more possibly contentious parts of the curriculum. It is important that we're all sort of singing from the same hymn sheet. So we'll use a scheme for those parts, whereas we use something that we've written in our school for the other parts of the curriculum. So that's kind of the way that we work around it in primary school. I think in secondary, I can imagine it gets a lot more difficult, because, well, I guess all subjects are kind of are taught by specialists differently in secondary to they are in primary, aren't they? Your maths teacher is different to your English teacher, who'd be different to your history teacher. And I think when I was at secondary school, we had a separate lesson, which was PSHE, which was taught by what would be viewed now as a PSHE specialist. And I think that was a good way to do it. I can only speak from that experience. I would imagine that it poses some quite big time challenges and quite big kind of staffing challenges for the people who are kind of in charge of making those decisions at secondary.
yeah, no, and it is, and I think it's really interesting because, although obviously you're right, in some schools they do have specialist PSHE and RSE teachers. Quite a lot of the feedback I've had is actually form teachers delivering it. I'd be really interested in any listeners what your feedback is, whether you have a specific PSHE teacher, or whether it is form teachers. But quite a few of the DMs I've had have been saying, it's form teachers, and it's kind of crammed into that time. So there's a little bit of inconsistency there, isn't there? And there's definitely a different, certainly regardless of how it is timetabled, there's definitely a completely different model for primary than secondary. And I think you make a really interesting point there about it being the staff members that the children are most familiar with, and therefore probably most comfortable with, and that also then you are creating that safe environment for the children to have those conversations with, because it's their class teacher and somebody who they have that, you know, that close bond with. So I think that's not something I've ever considered before around why it should be the class teacher. I think that's a really interesting point. But I guess for me, I think one of the things that's been interesting from primary colleagues that have reached out is that there is either they're teaching from a scheme, which obviously you said yourself you use for the relationships education, but that there isn't much opportunity for CPD. I think that's something that I personally advocate on quite strongly. I've been quite lucky in my provision that I've been given. I have autonomy to make sure that happens. But, you know, I think it can be quite difficult, can't it, for staff to go and say, actually, we need CPD on this. Is that something you think that staff do need to be able to do it? Is that the lead teacher's responsibility? How do you think that should look like?
I think I sort of, again, I hadn't thought about it until you kind of said it yourself then, that probably the reason definitely the reason I feel more confident teaching it than possibly other teachers do is because, like I said before, at university, we had quite a big focus on it. I think it was the years that I went to university was when the kind of the consultation and then the actual guidance was sort of given out and made statutory. So it was obviously the university had spotted that was something really important that we needed to be on top of. And so we got a lot of input surrounding that, and I guess that is what teachers who weren't at university at that time need to feel like they have got the understanding, a similar understanding of it to what kind of I feel I had from university. And I think that is, I guess it is up to the lead to kind of to sort of make that happen, to manifest that kind of CPD. But whether it is something that lead teachers feel is part of their role is kind of, I guess, dependent on the lead teacher.
Yeah, I think for me, as a kind of a top takeaway, it would be to say that to anybody that's either delivering it or is leading is to conference with your staff. I think part of making a really robust curriculum, PSHE and RSE curriculum, is to do that conferencing with any staff member that delivers it. And I think part of that is about reaching out to staff and in a safe environment going through the topics. And I say this for primary and for secondary. And checking with staff about their comfortability and how comfortable they are in delivering things, looking if there's any gaps in knowledge, so do they need any specific CPD or training or anything, but also about any of the triggering things that can come up from PSHE. You know, obviously I don't want to go into too much detail around the curriculum content because we'd be putting tons of trigger warnings out there, but there are some aspects of both primary and secondary curriculum that can be triggering for staff for a number of reasons. And I think sometimes it's about, one of the things I worked really carefully about was saying to staff, if there's anything that you're teaching that you feel is triggering because of your own lived experience, there's a confident, you know, come and speak to me confidentially and we'll look to cover that lesson. We'll look at how we deliver that lesson so that it's not triggering for you, not because of beliefs, etc., because that's different, but around lived experiences that staff might have had where it can be really triggering. For example, you know, in the primary curriculum there's things about bereavement. Well, if somebody's just had a bereavement, are they in the right space to deliver that? You know, moving into secondary there's a lot more complexities, you know, particularly things, you know, that you may need to conference with your staff on. So I think that's really important. And then having that open dialogue with the team, whoever delivers it, whether it is, you know, a small team, whether it's class teachers, and conferencing with staff and saying, are there any topics you think you need CPD on? Is there anything? And that collective shared learning as well, because, you know, there may be some staff, you know, like yourself, who've had a lot more experience, a lot more CPD than others. Is there opportunities for that shared learning in-house, or signposting staff to external CPD? I think is really important to take that time, because it is such a vital part of our curriculum now, and it needs to be done, you know, well, and it needs to be robust. But if there's gaps in staff's learning or there's issues there, we need to navigate that. And then if there is big gaps, if we do think there's a CPD need there, then you've got that evidence from feedback from staff to take it to SLT and say, this is what staff are saying, can we get some support? So that would kind of be my top takeaway. I don't know if you agree with that, Oscar, or...
Yeah, and I think one of the other kind of things that I'd written down about kind of when you said about possibly some sort of advice was that I think it's really important that PSHE is a subject that is about, it is about kind of looking inward for the children. It's about developing and kind of their feelings and emotions and how they are kind of within the world. And so part of that is for us as the teachers of that, are we practicing what we preach? And I think that that is really important when it comes to those parts of the curriculum which can be quite difficult to teach and can be, if you have certain experiences, can be quite triggering. So that kind of keeping yourself in mind, keeping us as the teachers in mind, and thinking inwardly and saying, actually, am I going to be able to teach this because of my experience of it, or do I feel capable of doing it, is a really important part of it.
Yeah, I think it is. It's creating that safe space for everyone, isn't it? The safe space for the children, but the safe space for the staff as well. And I think it's so hugely important. And like you said, it's practicing what we preach. We want our students to know that it's safe. We want them to. We literally teach in PSHE about personal boundaries. But then if we're not if we're not practicing that, if we're not reflecting, then I agree with you. We're not being authentic, are we? And it can be really difficult sometimes to do that. And I want to stress to colleagues, no, I know it can be difficult. No one's suggesting, just go and, bounce over to the head teacher's door and knock on and say, I'm not teaching this. We're not suggesting that, but having that opportunity to say, to talk to somebody, to talk about any worries that you've got, to talk to mention, this is quite triggering for me, is really important for that self-care. So, I think as leaders of PSHE and RSE, we need to be mindful of that, but also our teachers need to be mindful of that it's okay to reach out and say, well, this is triggering, or I'm worried about doing this, and getting that extra CPD, because sometimes that's a thing in itself, is admitting that you might not know about something, that you need CPD. Or even for the children, I cannot tell you how many times I've had situations where the students have asked me something and I've been honest and said, I don't know the answer, but I will find out for you. And so I think, just having that open dialogue is really important. So with that in mind, do you think, because we're clearly saying here that PSHE plays such an important part, is there enough time given to PSHE? Is it timetabled well enough in schools? We've got a tweet here from Paul, and Paul's a regular listener. Big shout out to him. Thank you for contributing as always. But it says PSHE is wrongly squeezed in during a half hour or so ticker box. RSE is grudgingly completed when necessary. It's much lower down in the food chain of subjects, but definitely has its importance in a culture of growing social and emotional problems. I couldn't agree more, Paul. But what do you think, Oscar? Do you think there's enough time given to PSHE?
I think on the whole, no. I agree with what Paul said, that where it is half an hour and you squeeze in the topic of the lesson within half an hour and it's never touched on again, is it's similar to how we talk about learning in all subjects. If we're not returning to things, if we're not revisiting them, if we're not bringing that knowledge up and using that knowledge, then it might as well be lost. That half an hour is wasted. And I think that's definitely true of PSHE, because it is one of those not core subjects that we do squeeze into half an hour, sometimes 15-minute in primary school, sometimes 15-minute slots, where what are we really achieving in that 15 minutes, and are we ever coming back to what we feel like we've achieved, to check that it's working or to check that it's had any impact? And I think a lot of the time the answer is no. Something that my school have done, and I know some other schools that I went on kind of placements to and things, to kind of try and build it up, is sort of fleshing out the time that it has in the timetable, for one, so giving it an actual block time that's similar to the amount of time that other subjects have within the kind of weekly timetable, and then also building in the topic of PSHE. So we have a kind of a sort of strand that follows throughout all years. So year 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 will all be learning on a similar learning kind of lessons based off a similar strand at the same time. So then our assemblies and kind of the way that we interact with children in and around the school in the context of not a lesson we know we can kind of base it all around that strand, because all of the children are sort of building up their knowledge of a part of PSHE that's in that strand. So I think the answer is no, not at the minute, but there are ways that we can kind of build it in such a kind of time squeezed sort of environment.
I really, and I love that idea. You know, I think that's a really positive way to do it, isn't it? I mean, personally, I would agree with Paul. I think particularly in primary, but also in secondary, I think there isn't enough time dedicated to it. I think it would be incredibly remiss of us not to talk about the importance of PSHE and RSE in regards to safeguarding. I'm also a DDSL, and I think that it's massively important. To have PSHE, because it literally equips our children with those life skills to help them be safe. And it also, you know, within the school environment itself, it sometimes opens up conversations that give you that piece of the missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle, which provides you with that safeguarding picture that you may have had relating to that pupil or that cohort. So, you know, I think it's massively important. I think we've got this issue around, you know, there's been lots of shows around, you know, behaviour, attendance, safeguarding itself. PSHE encompasses all those. You know, there's, you know, emotional well-being, resilience, mental health. It's huge, and I think it's unfortunate that for whatever reason it doesn't seem to be given the kudos it deserves. It doesn't seem to be given that timetabling and that care. I mean, you know, if we talked about core subjects and we said that pupils were going to have 15-minute lessons and that would be it, I think, you know, there'd be quite a lot of backlash to that. But I think, you know, in many schools they're getting a form time slot and it's like get it in, get it done, which is, you know, it is not an effective use of the way PSHE should be delivered. And you know, and I think if we evaluated it, I think our pupils and our students would probably say the same, that they're probably not getting the best out of what PSHE can be, because they're not getting that time to explore it fully and then develop those skills and that knowledge that then they can take out into the wider world. Oscar, I'm having the best time talking to you. I could do this all day, but I think it would be really remiss of me to just not mention our incredible partnership with John Catt Educational. They publish professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Or visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading. They are incredible, and I would highly recommend, if you're looking for things on PSHE, to go and check out their website and look for yourself. Oscar, honestly, this is just such an interesting conversation, and you know, and I think both of us are really incredibly passionate about PSHE and IRC and the impact it can have. But for perhaps for colleagues that are just starting out on their journey, or maybe just taking on that lead role, you mentioned before about evidencing, but how do we best evidence, you know, a meaningful and impactful curriculum? Because that's what we want, isn't it? We want our curriculum to be meaningful and impactful, but then we have to evidence it. So I guess that's two parts of the question. Firstly, how do we create a meaningful and purposeful curriculum? And then secondly, how do we evidence it?
I think the curriculum being meaningful kind of means different things dependent on who you are and where you are. So PSHE that I teach in Lewisham will be and should be directly related to the issues and the kind of the things that are going on in London and in Lewisham,
Yeah.
which will be different to when I was on placement teaching PSHE in St Helens near Liverpool. The issues that those environments are facing will be entirely different, and the PSHE that we teach and how we ensure that our children are developing holistically should be rooted in the environment, the community that we and that the children are in. So I think a meaningful curriculum differs where you are. The meaning of it differs because it has to differ because the areas differ. So
Absolutely.
the curriculum being meaningful, I think the first thing is that it can't be blanket. As much as we will use schemes, and like I said, my school uses it for the RSE part of the curriculum, it can't be used for everything, because the things that we are talking about and the issues that we're kind of trying to address through PSHE education are different from school to school. So that curriculum cannot be blanket. It has to have some flexibility to it that allows for different schools to interpret it in a way that they need to. Um, and I think the second part of it being meaningful is that it has to be taught, as we've kind of touched on already, it has to be taught by professionals who feel that they are capable of teaching it, who feel that they understand well enough the curriculum and the pedagogy behind how we teach it, and that they're also committed to it, that they understand the importance of PSHE. I think going back to what we were saying about it kind of often being squeezed into sort of little slots, I think the reason for that, or part of the reason for that, is because there are a lot of people within schools who may feel that PSHE can be taught implicitly through other things, because it is so wide ranging, because it covers everything, and we talk about it quite a lot of the time implicitly. They think that some people think that we don't need to teach it explicitly. It doesn't need that time. And I think actually, if we are building a meaningful curriculum, we need to acknowledge that actually we need time to achieve the goals of that curriculum, and we need time that isn't, in sort of squeezed into form time, like you said, in secondary, or squeezed in before an assembly, or right at the end of the day if it's in primary school.
Yeah, I hugely agree. I think that's massive. And so how do we go about evidencing it then? What do we, you mentioned before about floor books and things, which I think are really important, but, is there more that we can do? Is there, we were talking before about that impact and how, it's not, it can't just be demonstrated in a book, but how do we then demonstrate that it is effective? How do we evidence and evaluate that, do you think?
I think, I mean, it's really difficult, because we're kind of, it feels almost like we're stuck between a rock and a hard place, because we're kind of acknowledging that we haven't got the time we need to effectively teach it, and to deliver it as effective as it could be. But at the same time, for kind of reasons that we don't need to go into here, that we have to evidence it, and we have to kind of show evidence of the fact that we are teaching it and the impact that it does have. I think the compromise that we've sort of come to, that I've kind of come to as PSHE leader at our school, is that the evidence that's in the floor books, and the evidence that people come into school to actually physically look at, really needs to be little to none. Because what we kind of, or what I hope, and what we've started to see, is that through saving time in the lessons, and using more time to actually teach and engage in a conversation with the children, rather than creating a really laborious kind of piece of writing, or the actual kind of something physical that the children can stick in a book. In saving that time, we've got better conversations coming out. The teaching, we feel, is more effective, because we've got more time in the lessons to kind of explore the point of the lesson, the question, the children's feelings about it, and, like you said, link it back to things like safeguarding needs, to really kind of dive into those aspects, rather than rushing through the content in 5 minutes so that we can spend 10 minutes writing something so that we can stick it in.
Yeah.
We found that using that time more effectively in the lessons, and actually really stripping back the evidence, has meant that we're seeing more evidence of what we're teaching through their actions, and through their behaviour, and through the way that the children are engaging with the rest of the curriculum, and the way that they're able to articulate what we're talking about in PSHE. I think that our evidence, we found, is through that, rather than through, a kind of ink on a page.
Yeah, and I think that's massive, isn't it? And I think also it allows pupils who maybe have got barriers to literacy, or perhaps those anxieties around writing, it allows them to fully engage in the lesson without having that anxiety there, or that barrier. So I think finding ways to make PSHE engaging, and to focus more on the content is really important. One of the things that I've suggested to other people who are like, we've got to have something, is to sometimes voice record the conversations, the debates, the discussions, so you've got some evidence that way. Or sometimes at the beginning and the end of a module, to do a little tick sheet evaluation of what they knew before and what they know after, but that to be a very quick activity, so that, like you said, the main focus is all around that content, around that discussion, around those, the embedding those life skills, embedding that knowledge, so that they, so that you're building on that all the time, and they've got that acquisition of learning, and that real deep seated knowledge, I think, is just so important. And I just massively agree with you. But so what advice would you give? So we've talked a little bit about, obviously, the curriculum and making sure it is personalized, and making sure it is, it offers that bespoke approach. And we've talked a little bit about some of the ways you can evidence, and maybe putting more weight on that pupil voice and the content, rather than kind of working books. But what advice would you give to anybody who, not too dissimilar to you, is just starting out themselves, as either delivering PSHE or is leading on it? Have you got any top tips or advice for them?
Yeah, I think just to kind of to touch back on what you were saying about the voice recording, something that I'm a huge fan of, and I use it in like nearly all of the lessons that I teach, is a QR code that can kind of be stuck into a floor book or an exercise book of, a kind of, like you say, of some sort of recording. And then if the school or the local authority, whoever it is, requires something to be stuck in books, it could be a QR code that links to a kind of video or a voice recording, like you said.
Brilliant. I love that idea. I love that. I think that's a great takeaway for any new leads or teachers, is, reduce that workload, but also you've got a little bit of evidence to back it up there. I think that's a great piece of advice. Any other advice for any leads, or any teachers that are starting out, or even developed in their career? Just anything you think is important?
I think kind of similar to what you were saying, I guess, in terms of the staff feeling confident, is the kind of the PSHE lead being confident about what it is, and kind of linking back to what I was saying before about it being school related, about that PSHE lead understanding why we need to teach these parts of the curriculum. We need to focus more on that in this area. So kind of engaging with parents, engaging with the children, engaging with the staff, conferencing them, like you said, to try and understand which bits of the curriculum are really important here. Why do we need to focus a little bit more on this in this area, as opposed to this, which we can kind of see as okay. So understanding that and feeling confident enough to back that up if they're kind of asked about it, and also to be able to say, oh, do you know what? I've spotted this. I think we need to spend more time on this in our school, because it seems like there's a bit of a trend towards this.
I absolutely agree. And I think in conferencing with your staff as well, nobody knows the community better than the people that live in it. Nobody knows what these children face better than the families and the community. And I think drawing them in as well is really important, and conferencing with staff, whether they live in the local area or because they're teaching the local area, and looking at what the children are facing, look at what the community is facing, making sure that and being strong enough in conviction to say, do you know what, as a school we can see that this is becoming a trend, or we can see that our communities are facing these problems. How do we weave that into the curriculum so that we tackle that we support the children, that we make sure that PSHE curriculum is personalised, is also really, really important. And I think that's the same for the pupils. For me, conferencing with the children, what do they think are the biggest problems that they're facing at the moment? What do they think they need to learn about in PSHE? And I'll be honest, quite often it really surprises me what their values are compared to what I think they should be. So I think as a lead, having that regular conferencing with staff, with parents and carers, and then with the children, just helps you to create that really robust curriculum, doesn't it? And really, like you said, emphasises that personalisation, which then in turn makes the curriculum meaningful, which in turn supports the children, which in turn is evidence. So yeah, I think that's really important. Oscar, just finally, I want to ask you, how do you approach, your parents and carers that may be nervous or a little bit apprehensive or concerned about PSHE and RSE? How do you navigate that? How do you best support and engage with those parents?
So this is something, really, the first thing I'm going to say is something that I can't take any credit for, because it was done by the PSHE lead at the time and the deputy head at the time. But they, at the school that I teach at now, they hosted a kind of what I guess was a sort of a Q&A, a kind of a conferencing Q&A with parents and with the children of our local community. So before the school had written the policies that they needed based on the new guidance, so maybe 2 or 3 years ago this was now, and they had a conversation, that Q&A with the parents, with the children, about what this new guidance means, what it means that we will need to teach, and sort of explaining to the parents exactly what that means and why we need to teach it now, and then taking questions from them to try and understand if they've got, like you say, if they've got issues or they've got questions about it, to address those head on straight away before it was kind of I guess before the issue was allowed to kind of snowball and to get a little bit bigger than it actually was. And so I think for me now as PSHE lead, that's put me in a great position, because it's still the same parents that are kind of within the school, and whose children are still being taught following that policy. It's those parents who engaged with that who are still in the school. So I think that allowed us as a school to create a really positive culture around it, and it meant that we were kind of in a much better position than if we'd just kind of gone, this is our policy, this is what we're teaching, read it, and it starts as of this date. So I think I've been quite lucky in inheriting the PSHE subject in a school where it was kind of the parental engagement was already quite high, and it was already quite positive in that kind of in terms of PSHE and how we teach it. But I think it is really difficult, because a lot of the issues that kind of parents will raise are often issues that are kind of, I guess, wider sort of public issues, things that in the media are kind of posed to be quite a big issue, and that people even without children have quite strong opinions of. And so it can be quite difficult, because there's a lot of different players in the conversation. It's not as simple as a kind of a one-on-one conversation.
No, that's a really important point to make. Oscar, it's been absolutely brilliant to talk to you, and I really hope you stay on, because I've got so many more questions to ask you. But I'm really delighted that I've also managed to get another speaker on who hopefully can talk a little bit about from a slightly different perspective of someone that delivers training around a PSHE. So, Mal, I hope that you're there and can hear me. Can you hear me, Mal? Oh, we might be having a little technical issue here. Mal is what I would call TTR royalty, as she was described recently to me. She delivers training and CPD and is absolutely brilliant on all things PSHE. I'm hoping that you can hear me now. Can you hear me, Mal? We seem to be having a little bit of a technical hitch here. Mal, please do get in touch with the team just to see if we can rectify the problem, because we would really, really like to speak to you and to get your perspective, obviously as someone that delivers training around PSHE, around kind of those important issues. Hopefully you'll be able to get in touch with us soon, and obviously just share that knowledge, because it is really important. This isn't all primary based. We want to hear from people that deliver in secondary as well. Really, really important topic in both primary and secondary. I think Oscar's raised some incredibly brilliant points, particularly around that personalisation. And I would say from a secondary point of view, it can be quite tricky. Obviously, the content increases even more. I think the depth of it and the kind of the nuances of it can be quite tricky, particularly when you're dealing with students who are going through changes themselves, who can struggle. So it's really important that you create a safe environment. I cannot stress that enough. I think it can be really hard, particularly as so many people have said, they're delivering from a form time perspective, or perhaps it's crammed into the timetable, or it's a drop down day, maybe one afternoon every half term. It's difficult to create that environment, but you really have to try, because there's so much content that needs to be covered, but also our young people need a safe space to be able to open up to have those conversations. Mal, I'm just wondering if you're able to join us. Have we managed to fix our technical difficulty? Mal, are you there?
Hello.
Hi, Oh, thank you so much for joining
Yeah, I
us.
think I needed to be unmuted. I wasn't sure what was going on there, but never mind. I'm here.
I'm so delighted to have you on the show. Mal, would you be able to like introduce yourself to our listeners and just share a little bit about your background?
Yeah, sure. I'm from London and I taught history for 20 years, was a senior leader, responsible for teaching and learning and CPD across Multi Academy Trust, and that included PSHE. So, and once I had a couple of children, I still have them. Once I had them, I decided I wanted to spend more time with them and needed more flexible time. So I set up my own business as a consultant. And so I provide CPD in leadership, coaching, and PSHE.
Amazing. So obviously, you're coming at this from a very different perspective to Oscar and also myself, in terms, you're kind of supporting us in delivering that content and making sure we're effectively delivering PSHE and RSE. Why do you think PSHE and RSE is so important? Does the conversation so far for myself and for Oscar, we passionately believe it's so important, but do you agree? Why do you think it's important?
Absolutely. I came at it when when I did my PhD year 2000. You probably weren't born, but year 2000, it was hardly mentioned. And as far as I was concerned, I was training to be a history teacher, so it was a bit of a shock suddenly being thrown in a classroom and told you need to teach this. And I'm like, but I don't know anything about this. And then when I became an NQT, everybody around me were very experienced, and so when I asked questions, I was kind of shot down. So I didn't feel confident to ask anybody questions because they were like, "What's your problem?" kind of thing, and it really got to me. It was very difficult to teach, and especially the background I come from. I come from a South Asian background where you don't. I'd never said the word sex out loud. And then you've got all these other words as well. And I was like, oh my God. So I found it extremely difficult. But I also felt I couldn't talk to anybody about that either.
Yeah.
And I had zero training as well. And then when I became an assistant principal, I was suddenly in charge of, because part of humanities that I was responsible for was PSHE. And humanities was in such a state that all my concentration was on that. There wasn't any schemes of work. I had NQTs, OTTs, GTPs, Teach First, all in my faculty. So my concentration was elsewhere. And where the whole PSHE thing blew up for me was when I was rushing through the school to get somewhere. And one of the nurses who had been in, because it'd been organised by my predecessor, that they'd come in and talk to the kids about contraception, I think it was. And she said to me, oh, I just wanted to flag up something. And I was like, yeah, yeah. And she said, well, we're supposed to be here talking about contraception, but the children, the girls were asking about periods. And I was like, what? I was like, are you kidding me? And that was a real, I was like a slap in the face, because it was really hit home that, oh, crikey, because I was working in outer London, in Hillingdon, a borough where there's, one of the poorest boroughs in the country, and probably about 80% English as an additional language. So you've got communities where there's no way they're talking about this stuff at home. So I thought, oh crikey, I need to look into this, because this is really important. This is too important. They can't get to 14 and not know about periods. So I started to look into it. I did a few courses, and one of the major things I did was look at the statistics for the Botwell area where I was working. And I think you talked about this with Oscar, about the reasons why. Why are we teaching this? PSHE at the school was not popular. Teachers hated teaching it. Children hated, they just were just thrown onto computers and they could do what they like. It was not a respected subject. And when I looked at the statistics, I said to my head teacher, I need to share this with the rest of the staff. Can I have a slot in September inset? So I did September inset. I shared with them the numbers of young people who may not get pregnant whilst they're with us, but by the time they're 21, they'll have an unwanted pregnancy. And the lack of condom use, the number of STIs, and not just for the country, but for specifically the Botwell area. And the shock on the teachers' faces, they were like, oh my God. And then I said, and this is why this subject is so important at this school. Now, previous to me doing that, I was being shouted at across the room about, oh, I don't want to teach this. No, this is against my religion and blah, blah, blah. But I also shared with them the Equality Act of 2010 and said, you know, by law, we cannot discriminate. By law, this is your duty. By law, this is what we need to do. But regardless of law, we're talking about young people who need this education. And after that, I had zero backlash from the staff. And then I put in a whole program of CPD for the staff, and I had people fully on board. You know, they felt more equipped to teach it. And it rapidly, within a year, became children's favourite subject. They absolutely loved it because the teachers felt more equipped. And I mean, you talked about how do we assess how well we're doing. But and this was the days before you had things like Survey Monkey. I did these booklets where you have evaluations from the students from every single year and evaluations from staff every term on what went well, what do they need more help with, where do they feel the next CPD should be on. I mean, I had a program, but sometimes it was like, actually, there's a gap here. Let's change that and put something in. And so staff felt they could ask me, and children, you know, were very, well, we know what children are like, very honest about what they like, didn't like. And yeah, I was very proud of what we achieved at that school. And yeah, PSHE, the other thing I did was that humanities was taught once a day, whether it was history, geography, or RE. And what I did was I said that once a week we need to put in PSHE. So every Friday will be PSHE. And the head teacher wasn't sure at first. And I said, look, it's just too important for this community. And he's like, okay, let's do it. So once a week, Key Stage 3 had PSHE. And that made a huge difference as well.
Yeah, I think timetabling is such an important thing, and I think you know, similar to what Oscar said, I think we're all really passionate about making it really personalised and making sure that people has got that personalised approach. But actually, if you're the lead or a member of leadership and having to take, you know, take the argument to SLT or your head teacher to say, no, this can't just be, you know, 15 minutes. This can't just be form time. It needs to be more. It is about pulling that data, isn't it? About conferencing the children to see where the gaps in their knowledge is, taking that data from, and I champion this all the time, but public health data, your community from the local police, you know, all that, and take that to, you know, to the team and say, these are the issues our children are facing. This is where their gaps in knowledge are because they're telling us. This is what our staff and pupils are saying. It needs more time. And then you're giving it that more weight as well, aren't you? Because you're using that data to support why it absolutely
Absolutely.
needs.
Yeah, and it's this idea of timetable. I mean, I've worked in schools where it is just during form time and it is like a drop down day every few weeks or something. You know, it's like when people say, "Oh, how do I fit in exercise?" Well, the fact that you're saying trying to fit in exercise means you don't value it. And that's the same with PSHE. It should be a proper timetable subject. And if you're trying to squeeze it in here or there, then it's clearly not valued, and the children will see that. This
It's
is not a valued subject.
it's so interesting that you should say that, because Brent's tweeted, the irony is that the topic's content and the relevance of PSHE is the highest priority and usefulness to our kids, and yet in resources priority and in time is the most poorest of subjects. If it was
Yeah.
exactly different, which is so sad. It's true, isn't
Yeah,
it?
absolutely. I mean, what I remember having this boy, I had to pull him out of a lesson. he was a terror in that lesson. I mean, it was fine everywhere else. It was just that particular lesson he hated it. And I pulled him out, and he was in my office, and I was chatting to him, saying, "Oh, what's your favourite subject?" And he said, "Oh, PSHE." And I was like, "Oh, really? Tell me more." And he said, "Well, you talk about life and stuff, innit?" And I was like, "Yeah, that just sums it up." The fact that children feel they can talk about life and stuff in it, that's exactly what you want. You want them to be able to talk about their emotions. You want them to be able to navigate issues and be able to debate and have a chat and argue, but in a way that isn't so polarized the way society is these days in the UK. So you want those kind of skills.
Yeah. Oh no, absolutely. So what, obviously, because we're having those conversations, and particularly in secondary, they can be quite, as I mentioned before, they can be quite complex. They can be quite,
Mm,
um, they can be quite challenging because as particularly as we move up through the curriculum into secondary, the topics and the content becomes so much more detailed and reflect
mm.
what our children face. What what do you think the challenges are for our teachers in navigating that, and in making sure that the curriculum's kind of robust and covers what needs to be done? How do our teachers navigate that?
Again, I think that's another mindset issue because if we're coming at it, say, I mean, like I said, I taught history. If you're teaching history, there's an awful lot of knowledge and content that needs to get through. Now, with PSHE, it's more about the skills. It's more about, okay, can they be assertive? Are they able to say no to certain things? If they can say no to a cigarette, they can say no to sex, they can say no to a range of things. The, we want them to be able to work on their skills over the years rather than, there is no point knowing that this is a class A drug and that is a class B drug if you can't say no to peer pressure of someone trying to make you take drugs.
Yeah, yeah,
So in that sense, it's the skills that are important.
absolutely. So how do we, because I know I mentioned it with Oscar before, and Oscar gave a really, really interesting sort of answer for primary around evidence in it. But if we want them to have that acquisition of skills, we want them to be able to demonstrate it. But for schools where there is a pressure to evidence, how do we evidence it?
Yeah, I have a real issue with this evidence stuff. Who's the evidence for? And what is the purpose of this evidence?
Yeah,
Fair enough if you're seeing it like you would any subject where you need to know what progress they're making. But the language around PSHE assessment and evidence is, well, wrong, I believe, because it's all about, oh, what can we show that they've done? What can we show that they've done? And I'm like, why? There's no point showing that they've done sex education, if you can ever do sex education completely, if they're going to go off and get pregnant by the time they're 16. It's just what we, that's what I mean by the skills is, lately I've been making these rubrics, kind of like rubrics around being assertive, like what is the ultimate we want from children? They want to be able to say their wants and needs without being aggressive or too passive or something like that. We want them to be able to say no. We want them to stand up to peer pressure. We want them to be able to argue their point of view. And so I've been creating these rubrics so that it's easier for teachers to be able to assess where their pupils are and for young people to be able to peer assess themselves or self assess themselves. Because the other reason is, and part of the training that I give teachers, and something that I found like 15 years ago when I was training teachers on how to teach assertiveness to young people as part of PSHE, is that teachers 100% of the time couldn't show me how to be assertive.
mm,
They would show me being passive or being aggressive. And I'm like, okay, that's not, so I'd give them a scenario like so and so, Mr. So and so asked Miss So and so out, and Miss So and so say no. Okay. And you'd hit, Miss So and so would be like, oh yeah, I'm really sorry, I'm really busy that day, And I'm like, yeah, that's not really assertive. You're making excuses, you're being passive. Oh, okay. And then somebody else goes, oh, I can do it, I can do it. And then they'll come up and go, yeah, and say something really rude. And I'm like, right, okay, that's not being assertive. So part of the training, and it's like Oscar mentioned about emotional regulation earlier, a lot of adults don't have this. They don't know how to emotionally regulate themselves and they don't know how to be assertive. So, part of the training that we give teachers is that, because we can't assume that teachers know how to teach being assertive, how to manage risk, we can't assume this because teachers were once kids who had possibly difficult childhoods, who possibly went through all kind, like you were saying about triggers, they've probably been through all that. So they may not know how to be in this kind of way. So we're getting them to teach pupils on how to be assertive, but they don't know how to be assertive themselves.
That's such
And I
an
think
point.
that, and so when it comes to CPD, that's why CPD is so, so important.
I massively agree. And actually, on that, it would be really remiss of me just not to mention our incredible sponsors again, John Catt Educational, who publish professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools across the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. So important, like you said, about CPD. And that brings me on to another question, Mal. Is there enough CPD for staff? And, we've Oscar's mentioned, obviously, really interesting point about class teachers delivering PSHE and RSE in, or relationships education, I should say, in primary, because that's who the closest bonds with, and it shows that this is a subject that all teachers and that all people experience. That's really important. In secondary,
Mm.
sometimes it's form teachers, sometimes it is a specialist teacher, but it isn't always. And like we said, sometimes it's crammed into these slots, sometimes staff haven't got the CPD. Is enough training given to staff? And what if staff feel like they need training? How do we navigate that?
Short answer, no. Uh, there's not enough training. And I tell you what, part of the problem is that often you get a teacher that you don't, from a leadership perspective, you don't want them to leave. So you want to give them a management point. So, okay, PSHE is going. So let's give them PSHE to lead. And from a SLT perspective, they're not thinking of this holistically. They're thinking of this, oh, we just need somebody to be in charge of this subject that's going to sort out the schemes of work and make sure everyone's teaching it. But the reality is, if you're leading PSHE, it's a whole school subject. And if
Yeah.
you think about whole school subjects, tend to be English, maths, science. There's not many subjects that are whole school. And then with English, maths, and science, you have specialist teachers. So you've got someone who's leading PSHE who usually hasn't got much experience of leadership, and they're navigating parent, teacher, and pupil backlash. They're dealing with pedagogy around sensitive topics. It's a different kind of pedagogy. I mean, you know this. It's a different kind. I mean, it completely transformed the way I taught history with all the studying I did around PSHE. And you're managing a range of staff whose primary subject is not your subject that you're responsible for. And that requires leadership training, leadership CPD. And I can tell you, 9 out of 10 PSHE leaders do not have this leadership training. And I think that is hugely remiss. And quite often, they've got quite a big timetable. They might be given 1 hour a week if you're lucky. One person I saw on Facebook in a Facebook PSHE group said that she had 1 hour a fortnight to lead the subject. And I said to her, you need to go back and have a word, because that's not how are you supposed to lead a subject like this, which is crucial in terms of legally what you are and aren't allowed to talk about. And you've got sensitive areas. You need to be so sure that you've got this right. And you never know, one little thing gets out, and then people misunderstand, and that could create huge furore in the community. It's a massive responsibility. So training is absolutely required for the PSHE leads. And it's just like I say, the PSHE lead may not know how to emotionally regulate. They may not know how to be assertive. And then they're supposed to be providing CPD for the rest of the team who are teaching this. So I think the starting point is the PSHE lead. We can't get everybody in the school that teaches PSHE to do training unless you've got a really well-trained PSHE lead who could do it in-house.
Yeah. I think in how we mentioned, Oscar and I talked before about that conferencing all the time, and offering staff that opportunity to talk about gaps in knowledge or go through the curriculum
Yeah.
and say, I'm not quite sure on this area or that area, and
Mm.
navigating and creating that safe space, which I talked about before, for pupils to have, but also for staff to have, to talk about and identify those gaps, and then identify, it be a shared learning experience where you share that knowledge between yourselves because, like you said, the leads had that training, or is it something that you identify as a group that everybody needs to have that training and that specific CPD? And it's really about that continual reflective practice, isn't it? And evaluating that curriculum. Is it as meaningful? Is it as purposeful? Is it as bespoke and as personalized as it can be?
Exactly.
You know
Yeah.
and then from that, okay, these are the hot topics, this is what we need to address. How do we do it? Who can do it? Who's comfortable? Do we have gaps?
Mm.
Do we need to do more training on it? Do we need to ask for more time? Do we need to get an external agency in? Do we need to reach out to our local agencies? Like, it really is such a jigsaw puzzle to put together. And then
It is.
as Oscar and I both said, and then there's the safeguarding aspect of it, isn't there? And like
Mm.
yourself, it plays such a huge part in safeguarding. And yet and that in itself takes training, and being able
Yeah.
to be confident in your safeguarding policies, how you approach those subjects if they come up, or those issues if they come up, and then how you ensure the safeguarding of the children in the class, and the staff as well. I think
Yeah. Yeah.
it I think you've so more eloquently than I ever could really brought home how important PSHE is within the curriculum, and yet even like so many people have said, it's just not given that weight, is it? And it's not given that CPD
But
weighting.
it goes all the way to the DFE, because a few years back, myself and a few other PSHE, you know, consultants were asked to come to the DFE, and they were asking our advice on the curriculum and stuff. And so we went in, and they said, "Okay, so we're thinking of doing this, this, and this. What are your thoughts?" And I said, "Well, you can give that to schools, but is it backed up with training? Is it backed up with CPD?" And they're like, No. And we all sat there going, "Well, there's no point then, because you can hand over a scheme of work, but unless you train people to use it, y- it's pointless." Because, like you say, you can't just have something off the shelf that works in every single school. You
Yeah,
have to consider, the nature of the community. You have to consider the context of the school. You have to talk about what's relevant to the children in that area. You have to think about the staff and their own values. And it doesn't mean that you're adjusting what you're teaching. You're looking at, okay, these are their values, but I probably need to, we probably need to hit home a bit more about the Equalities Act and what their responsibilities are in a British school. So it's that sort of thing, because I work with international schools as well on PSHE, and they're British international schools, but they have, like, because I live in Spain, they have like Spanish kids in their schools, and so it can get a bit muddied. Like, oh, am I? They're very traditional, and I was like, there might be traditional backgrounds, but they're in a British school, and so you're following the British curriculum. And they're like, "Oh, okay, okay." So it can get a bit muddied sometimes, but actually it is very simple.
That's such, and because of course we hadn't even considered those international schools and the kind of the complexities that they may face. But you know,
Mm,
like you're saying, we've got to be. It's that simple. We've got a duty of care to teach PSHE. We've got a duty of
yeah.
care to teach that relationship education, or in secondary that sex education. And I think we've got to be clear on that and passionate about it, but also, like you said, trained in it, and make sure that we are,
Mm,
because it is a minefield. And I've had so many DMs and tweets around kind of some staff expressing quite a lot of anxiety. Oh, it's a bit of a minefield. It feels like, when we get to the relationships or the RSE part of the curriculum, we're kind of all on tenterhooks thinking, oh, what's going to come out and stuff. And I think for me,
mm,
I think Oscar said it really good towards the end of our chat about, he was talking about, his school and how obviously, the consultation had been done before and the parents were really
mm.
bored. But I think that for me, I don't know about yourself, constantly offering that consultation, reaching out to parents,
Yeah,
and for,
yeah.
we obviously we've got our obligation to publish resources, offer those published resources if parents and carers request them, but also to publish our curriculum maps, etc. But for it
Mm,
tokenistic, for it to be more than that, inviting parents to come in and see what we're doing and present them with the data
yeah,
as well, so that they can see why it is that we're focusing on that particular area. Or
yeah,
I
yeah.
don't know what
Yeah,
yours
it's this.
are.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and it's also the same with staff, because there's so much misunderstanding out there. And like when, you see it in the papers and say, oh, they're teaching sex education to 4-year-olds. Well, that's because they don't understand the spiral curriculum. They don't understand that actually you're not teaching about sex to 4-year-olds. You're teaching them about hygiene, about how to wash their hands and look after themselves and respect themselves. And that over time turns into relationships and friendships and emotions, and looking after yourself, sexual hygiene, and respecting yourself, and and peer pressure and the pressure of having sex and all those kinds of things. But that doesn't happen overnight. You're not teaching that to 4-year-olds. It starts somewhere, and the language around it perhaps isn't quite right. And communication is key. Like CPD is key, but I think the other big pillar of PSHE is communication. And so when all those years ago, when I was a very naive senior leader, and I just thought that, oh, my passion will get everybody on board. Rubbish, And then I had people yelling at me across the room, but we shouldn't be teaching sex ed. This is parents, blah 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 blah. And one of the ringleaders, I got her over and I said, look at this booklet. And she's like, well, I don't need to look at it because I want to. And I was like, just look at the booklet. And she looked at it, and I was like, just look at the content and look at the titles of each um, topic area we're looking at. And she looked at it, she went, oh, this is more about relationships. And I was like, yes. We're not teaching the plumbing, we're not teaching the ins and outs of actual sex, we're like literally, what we're actually doing is teaching young people about relationships and respecting themselves and to make their own, decisions. And when she got that, she was fully on board. But because the word sex is in there, I think people get triggered all over the place. They're like, kind of thing. So, yeah, so communication is really important about what it is that you are actually teaching and what the purpose is, the why, and the how.
And I
Why
think,
are you teaching this and how do we teach this?
and sharing that data as well, like you said,
Yeah.
obviously, there's so much data out there, as I say, public health, like your police, your your electoral roll. There's lots of information. You can get loads of data to back up
Mm,
doing those specific things. And I think that conferencing all the time with the staff, with pupils, with parents and carers, and getting their voice about what they think is important and what's not, and then saying, well, this is why we're covering this. This is why this particular area has got more focus and more weight than that, because actually this is an area that we know is affecting young people, and we need, and it's
Yeah.
directly affecting our young people, and that's why we need to do it. And about, I agree with you massively about sharing it with whole school, because I think in primary it's a little bit different, and Oscar will be able to tell us more on that. But in terms of, if all your class teachers are delivering PSHE, then when you do those discussions or that training, or it's the whole school. But and teacher, TAs and teaching assistants should absolutely be invited to those conversations. But in a
Yeah.
big secondary, you might just have a department, when actually, as mentioned from the tweet from John before, philosophically it's everyone's responsibility
Yeah.
to be a PSHE
Absolutely.
teacher. So
Yeah.
share that information, and we should share that content with the whole staff. So CPD and sharing that information as a whole school, as hard as it is as leadership to find that time, because inset days, etc., and twilights and training sessions are valuable.
Yeah.
It is, even if it's once a year, is so important, because it helps all teachers to understand what our young people are facing, which then direct
Yeah.
their experiences of teaching the children as well. Do you agree?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. It's like Oscar said, we're all responsible for it. In secondary, we can get. I mean, this is where primary is great because they're all in it together, really. In secondary, we can get stuck in our little silos. Oh, somebody else is responsible for that, and it can get a bit, isolated. Certain people in charge of that, certain people in charge of that. But like the truth is that things like resilience, growth mindset, being assertive, teaching young people to, how many times I used to say to young people, okay, this isn't EastEnders. You can ask me, you can speak to me about what you disagree with, but try and do it like, like you're not on a soap opera. Right? And but all teachers would have those conversations with children on how to express themselves, how to talk about their emotions without being too emotional. That is a responsibility of all staff, whether we like it or not.
Yeah.
We all have those heated conversations. Okay, it's not about sex or not about relationship, but we all have relationships.
And so I guess it's a culture that we build, don't we, where we put
Yes.
and their skills acquired from PSHE and RSE at the forefront of the school, and celebrate these skills are maybe addressed within PSHE and RSE, but actually are being implemented across the school, and so there's a real value to the subject, and that's why it's got to be
Yeah.
tackled. And actually for leads that are listening, or teachers that are listening, that they feel like it needs more timetabling, please get your head teacher to listen to our show today, but also maybe take some of the feedback from the show, from the evidence of your community and from your pupils, your students, and take it to them. And don't go down and bash the door open, but go in and knock and be assertive and say, we need to talk, can we have a conversation? Because actually, without timetabling it, and putting that, and the whole school putting that weight, that emphasis, that value on PSHE and RSE, we're not actually we're not actually supporting our pupils in making that lifelong progress, and developing those really important skills.
Especially today when mental health and well-being for young people and teachers is on an all-time low. It's the holistic development is the responsibility is everyone in the school,
Yeah.
absolutely everyone, from the site manager all the way through to the head teacher and so on. It's so important that staff know how to deal with young people that find it difficult to deal with their emotions because they don't always have that role modeled well at home. And the type of programs you see, some of these programs on TV, they don't role model that either. It's like you have a row with someone and suddenly somebody's under a patio or something. It's just, yeah, where do they see good role models? Well, the best place is probably school. But then at school, if you've got teachers that can't emotionally regulate themselves, part of this CPD that I provide is to help the teachers as well to be able to regulate their emotions, be more assertive, able to navigate difficult conversations. Because you must have seen this because you're in secondary too, where teachers are just yelling at children. And just saying that they're yelling at children, right? And I'm going to hold my hands up when I've lost it in the past. I've yelled at kids, but I've always said sorry, I have to say. And because you're a human being, you are going to lose it.
Yeah,
But when you've got people just, I remember talking to a girl outside the classroom, and I used to just talk to them and say, look, you've come in, you know, all over the shop, and you've been a bit rude. How about we go in and start again? Is there anything you want to say to me? Oh, sorry, miss. And so I rarely gave detentions because I talk to the children and the important thing is to get them to understand that they did something wrong. Okay, they won't do it again. End of. It's not about, I don't see it as punishment. It's more about talking to people. And anyway, I'd sorted it out with this young girl. One of the other assistant principals walks past, then doubles back, and then just bollocks her. Just, just an absolute massive rollicking. You're always in trouble. You're this and you're that. And I stood there, and I was just in complete shock that this guy had absolutely nothing to do with this conversation, calm conversation I was having with this teenager, and he just lost it with her, and she was shaking and upset and angry. And I was like, oh, when you're just going, oh God, that's it. My lesson's ruined now.
I,
But after he went, I had to calm her down all over again.
yeah,
And I just thought, oh my God, and this is where he might have been having his own issues. So, but he's taken it out on that kid. But then the ripple effect of that was horrific. And she just felt I'd got her to a state where she was nice and calm and ready to come in and work. But he just came along and blew it all up, But we've all seen that.
I
Anyone in secondary schools.
I definitely think that's where PSHE plays such an important part because it gives everybody those life skills, and that's how to
Yeah,
reflect skills and to part of PSHE, like you said, is communication and is about reflection. And I think that's plays a huge part, doesn't it, in PSHE and why we champion it so much. Mal,
yeah.
we're going to run out of time. I could talk to you all day. You are absolutely brilliant, and I just want to say a huge thank you to yourself and to Oscar for coming on today, because I genuinely have absolutely loved hearing from both of you and from your different perspectives of kind of primary and secondary. It's been incredible. I've written some takeaways for myself that I'm going to think about, but for listeners, I would say constantly review your curriculum, personalise it where possible, and use that data, whether it's feedback from staff, students, parents, your community, whether it's public health, police, whether it's your census, whatever it is. Use that data, use that voice to personalise your curriculum. Think about what's happening in the wider and local community. Mal, that definitely, and Oscar, both from you, is something that's I'm going to really take away from today. There are lots of good resources out there, but remember to be careful and make sure that you're thinking about how to use them and whether they're appropriate to use. Reach out to charities and local organisations. If there's gaps in CPD, if there's areas that you think your pupils need more support on, reach out to those charities and organisations. You'd be surprised how many of them will come in and support. I also think CPD, can't stress it enough, both from Oscar and Mel today, CPD regularly, whether it is as a team, individually, or whether it's as a whole school, I think is really important. And as part of that, check in, look for gaps in pupil knowledge, but also in staff knowledge, and really, really put that weight and emphasis on CPD for everyone involved in teaching PSHE and RSE. It's what helps staff feel more comfortable, and it's certainly in what gives us the skills to be able to deliver a really, really high quality curriculum. Make sure you create those safe spaces, not just for pupils, but also for staff as well. Make sure that you're giving opportunities to have those confidential conversations with staff if they need additional support. But for pupils, creating that safe space, whether it's informed time or a timetable lesson. If you can, perhaps some anonymous feedback, surveys, or absolutely, if you can, like a drop-in box where pupils can ask questions and then they can be addressed within the classroom at a later date is a really good way of engaging. And finally, it's okay to not know. There are going to be questions that are asked that you don't know the answer to. Don't try and answer them if you don't have that knowledge. Go away and say to pupils and students, I actually don't know, I'm going to have to go away and look and find out that information for you, and then come back armed with that knowledge, so that you're giving our students the right and correct knowledge, but also you're showing them that we don't know everything, that PSHE and RSE is an ever evolving topic, because what it covers is ever evolving. So there are, that you're never going to be able to know everything. It has been an absolute pleasure to do this show today. I am, like everybody here, so passionate about PSHE and RSE. It really does offer an opportunity to equip our children with lifelong skills and knowledge. So as Oscar said and Mal said, don't always worry about the evidence. But if your school isn't buying into it, isn't valuing it in the same way that you think it should, then maybe it is time to have those conversations. Arm yourself with that evidence. Arm yourself with the feedback. Even arm yourself with this show, and ask your head to listen to this show. But do champion it, because it's through PSHE and RSE that we can really change our pupils' lives and give them those skills and knowledge that will last them a lifetime. Thank you so much for listening today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Again, a huge thanks to Mal and to Oscar. Please follow them on social media. They're both absolutely fantastic and have a wealth of knowledge and experience and opinions that are really, really valuable. So please give them a follow. And thank you very much for tuning in today. I will see you all again soon. Thanks very much. Take care, everyone.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.